Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olha and I'm happy to see you in Ukraine Media Center, Ukraine Forum. Today's day 448 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by a Russian aggressor. And now we will be talking about our people who end up in temporarily occupied territories, about the information vacuum they end up in. And joining us as the guests are the analysts of OPORA Civil Network, Anasatasia, Romaniuk and Olha Snopok, who will present their research dedicated to the way Russia restricts access to the Ukrainian information field in temporarily occupied territories. So please, Miss Anasatasia, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank everybody who joins us here and online. We are happy to present the results of our research. And first of all, we would like to thank the armed forces of Ukraine who are waging this most important war in the temporarily occupied territories, who try to liberate our citizens in the temporarily occupied territories. And also I want to thank the air defense forces who allowed us to gather here all together. So talking about the information policy of Russia in temporarily occupied territories, it's known that since 2014 this practice is being implemented in systemic manner. One of the first steps after Russia captures some territory, they impose censure and limit restrictions on the access to the information for local population, and they replace Ukrainian information field with Russian. This is why we had to make this research and how this process is going on. Our research consists of two parts. First is how Russia blocks Ukrainian information media in temporarily occupied territories, how they restrict the operation of internet providers, how they reroute the traffic to Russian internet to impose the same legislative restrictions on our citizens that are effective in Russia, how they switch the cell carriers off to impede the access to Ukrainian information field in temporarily occupied territories. And the freedom of information is one of the fundamental human rights, and in accordance with the Geneva Convention, the state that controls those territories is in charge of protecting the rights of citizens who live in those territories. And the restriction of information field is yet another violation of human rights by Russia. Another part of our research is how Russians try to plant their information field there. What are the social networks which are blocked for the inhabitants of the temporarily occupied territories, and how they can only work in those networks that they can receive the propaganda. In our case, it's Telegram and Vkontakte. The first thing we paid attention to in our research was how Russia creates isolation in temporarily occupied territories by blocking Ukrainian websites. Generally, Russia has a very long practice of blocking of websites. The first ones were happening in Russia within the period from 2000 to 2010, but it acquired the systemic nature, this practice of website blocking, starting from 2014 after adoption of number of laws in Ukraine which expanded the authorities of Russian prosecutor's office for blocking websites, for promulgating some extremist content on the websites of the international media which are not registered in the international media list, and the blocking of the websites for so-called fakes about Russian army and their activities in Ukraine. after Russia captures some territories, they switch off Ukrainian providers and they bring their providers there to spread all those regulations in the and restrictions in the occupied territories that are in effect in Russia and in internet space in Russia. So we can assume that those websites that are blocked in Russia, they're mostly likely blocked in temporarily occupied territories as well. So we analyzed the register of websites blocked in Russia. The list is being maintained by Roskom Svoboda. It's not the best source of information, I must say, but since the Russian government authorities such as Prosecutor's General Office or Roskomnadzor, they are not famous for some transparency, still they're the only sources that we can analyze. So we identified 979 Ukrainian web resources that are blocked in Russia and most likely in temporarily occupied territories. Most of them are the websites of the mass media, news organizations, and in their example we can see that there are national media such as NV, Liga, Ukrainian Pravda, and the local media of Volnovakha, Energodar, and other cities as well. Another or second category by the number, the second category of the blocked websites are the official websites of Ukrainian authorities, the most of Ukrainian ministries, maybe all of the Ukrainian ministers, the website of the Office of President, and so on and so forth. And another big category is the websites of civil organizations, the websites of the human rights organizations, volunteer centers, such as, for example, in the territory, in the temporarily occupied territories, the website of Come Back Alive is blocked, and the majority of the websites which raise donations for armed forces of Ukraine and those who document the war crimes of Russian Federation in Ukraine, all of them are blocked there. Another part of our research was how Russia, what are the means that Russia uses to implement those restrictions in practice, and so that their restrictions are effective to limit the access or to restrict the access to Ukrainian information field, they need technical means. So starting from 2014 to implement that, Russians were resorting to first pillaging and capturing of equipment of in the offices of Ukrainian cell carriers or internet providers. Part of them were captured, the others had to reroute their traffic to Russian Federation and under the threats of torture and blackmailing and other forms of violence. So now we know about at least 46 Ukrainian internet providers who were forced to cease their activities in temporarily occupied territories, and now there are 11 providers operating in those areas. I wouldn't say Russian because they are like gray local providers which are active specifically in temporarily occupied territories, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when the area of temporarily occupied territories increased, Russia continues connecting those providers who were active in so-called LPR and DPR, and they reroute the traffic through the systems laid through Crimean Peninsula. And from the point of view of the cell carriers, well, I apologize, there are 11 those hybrid gray internet providers, so why don't they have their Russian providers work there? They make it in order not to have those official Russian providers end up under sanctions. This is why there are no Russian providers in temporarily occupied territories. Fortunately for us, the situation is a little bit more complicated for the cell carriers, but the situation was the same as with the mobile carriers. The offices of Kyivstar and LiveCell were captured in 2015, and on the basis of those networks, the Russians established the operation of their mobile carriers. And jamming of cell communication is way more difficult, but Russians managed to do it on a periodic basis. But now, fortunately, we cannot say that they were able to jam cell communication in a systemic nature, but we continue documenting cases when Ukrainian cell operators, cell carriers are unable to work, and in the same way the gray hybrid cell carriers which work in LPR and DPR, they were jamming the access to their mobile internet to increase their control over traffic. And just recently, in the end of April, when this research was almost ready, they stated about the resumption of operation of their cell carriers, first in Lugansk region, and then it would spread to other regions. Usually, if we don't have free access to websites or other sources of verified information, we resort to the social media. Sometimes the content is not so good quality and it's not so easy to find it there, but still we can do it. In the temporarily occupied territories, the situation is different because the majority of social networks was blocked there, the ones that we are using on a normal basis. In 2022, Facebook and Instagram did it. That was the copy of what they did in Russian Federation, and it spread to temporarily occupied territories further on. A little bit later they blocked Viber, because just like the local commanders said that armed forces of Ukraine were collecting information through Viber, so it had to be blocked. Then this restriction was imposed on Google and YouTube, and in somewhere in February 2023 it was announced that Messenger, the Meta Messenger, would be blocked along with Zoom video conference services. So when we survey everything that we've just described, it becomes clear that Russian Federation blocks everything they cannot control. And it's quite interesting that the main channels of communication of Russian Federation in the temporarily occupied territories are Telegram and VKontakte. Yeah, just like Olga mentioned, for the Russians, as we like to say among us, Telegram is a wild field due to, first of all, lack of transparency in the company itself, and the least number of moderation policies that are imposed by Telegram on the content that is being spread in their platforms. For example, in case of Meta, in case of their Instagram and Facebook products, the content is being controlled, and in some situations obviously it may be harmful for us. We remember the cases when until recently Facebook was deleting all the posts which mentioned the Azov battalion, but the social networks, they continue improving their policies to make sure the harmful content is not being spread. And Russian war in Ukraine, it jeopardizes lives and health of all the Ukrainians. And Telegram, unlike, well, under the banners of the freedom of speech and an alternative to the oppressive social networks that impose such principles on their users, Telegram doesn't have such restrictions, and now they're one of the biggest communication platforms where occupational government and the Russians themselves can deploy their activities. We had a research back in summer of the occupational Telegram channels, and we documented 118 Telegram channels which were created specifically for the occupied territories. When we continued our research in a year, in March this year, so the base was expanded to 640 channels, and among those Telegram channels we identified the following categories. First of all, local media. So they pushed all the independent Ukrainian media from that information space, and they made a replacement for them which create an illusion of happy life under Russian government, and they spread Russian propaganda and misinformation through those channels that discredit armed forces of Ukraine and Ukrainian government. We see media that the local police was arresting some criminal, and that criminal turns out to be either Ukrainian military or a veteran of anti-terroristic operation, and at the same time that very same media they show some good image of work of Russian military in those territories. Another category is the official platforms for communication of the local occupational governments, the proxy governments, executive bodies with the population, so the administrative channels. The third category is the charity or volunteer foundations. We see there different forms of unities supported by Russian organizations, Russian cities, as they inform how they support Ukrainians in temporarily occupied categories. Category 4 is the publicly exposed persons. It's like the local proxy governors. And the fifth category is something that we generalized as the local OLX, a large number of channels where people try to find and to procure and sell some goods and services. That's an indicator that could help us see the real life of and the needs of the people there. So people exchange a pack of juice for children's clothing there. They look for materials to rebuild their damaged property. There are job offers and people looking for jobs there, along with the goods and services. Also, we observed the dynamics of creation of those Telegram channels, and what was surprising for us is that the construction of this big information field, of this infrastructure, started after the 24th of February, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So specifically on the case of Telegram, we cannot say that there was some preliminary systemic preparation going on there, which would be another reason for us to think that potentially in the Russian government there was some asymmetric information regarding the development of the battle operations, because we see in this graph the new channels for the occupied territories, they started emerging almost day by day, and they were created not according to the dynamics of the movement of Russian army, but again we see a lot of channels for the places which never ended up in occupation. They are quite far from the forward edge of the battle area, and this is the indicator of Russian ambitions, how far they were intending to move. And the darkest stripes on this graph are the days when the Telegram channels were created en masse, in batches. So those are the graphs which demonstrate when the channels that were created for different Ukrainian cities, and they are quite scarce, as we can see. we also made a sampling of Telegram channels to understand what are the main topics that Russians discuss in those platforms, and one of the most important platforms was social support by Russia of the Ukrainians in temporarily occupied territories. They published some disclaimers how to get some payments, how to get a Russian passport, how it will help to build the new life of Ukrainians in occupied territories. And another type of content is the cultural integration of Ukrainians in temporarily occupied territories with Russian/Soviet culture. Why do we emphasize this Soviet aspect? Because first of all, how this integration is happening, they inform about some lectures, some art exhibitions, culture events, publications like This Day in History, and it's usually from Soviet history, when that city or town was occupied by Soviet Union. Some remarks of Soviet writers, and we see very little things about modern Russian culture in this aspect. Another category is the references to the Soviet era, happy inhabitants of those cities during Soviet times, how nice it was, how everything was flourishing, and what were some prominent events happening in those areas. Another category is integration with other regions of Russia. We see a lot of communications about, first of all, they have such a phenomena as patronage of Russian cities over Ukrainians. They help the Ukrainian cities financially, they support the local governments and professional organizations with advice. I mean, in temporarily occupied territories, material, volunteer support, and professional support. Another category is discreditation of Ukrainian government. I won't stop on that for the second time. And the last category, I never thought that we will have this category separated, but there is such a huge amount of this content that we have to emphasize it. Is the struggle, the fight with alcohol, narcotics, smuggling, and so on and so forth. So it's a law enforcement context, and the only thing happening against all laws in temporarily occupied territories is alcohol and drugs, and this is what local law enforcement agencies fight against. Generally, talking about VKontakte among Ukrainian investigators, it's not a very popular topic to study, because due to obvious reasons, VKontakte is banned in Ukraine since 2017, so it's kind of omitted in all the investigations. But talking about temporarily occupied territories is the only big social network available in temporarily occupied territories where people can communicate, and in this view we decided to research this social network. So we've picked 103 big cities in temporarily occupied territories, and we identified that only 65 of them had active pages in VKontakte between 24th February 2022 and 31st of March 2023. And in those 65 cities, we identified 1,039 pages of occupational government in Vkontakte social network. So it's a big platform for communication, and it shouldn't be omitted in other researches. It's really worth studying and investigating further on. A little bit about the geography. So we've checked the cities. Out of those, we picked the most actively the pages were in Vkontakte were created. Again, I have to emphasize, we did not take into account the places which were occupied before the 24th of February 2022, because there the media infrastructure was built for a long time, since 2014, and it doesn't make any sense comparing what happened in the occupied territories after the 24th of February and what's happening now. This is why we got focused on those pages which were covering the life of those places which were occupied after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and the most active pages were found for Mariupol. It's 182 pages, is the biggest number. Almost 18% of the total number of pages identified by us. A little bit less, almost twice less, were identified for Kherson. However, it's been deoccupied for more than half a year, and what's interesting is that the pages of Kherson, they remain active even no matter that the region was deoccupied way before. There are a lot of news how Kherson region lives under the Russian occupation. Well, we have part of Kherson region still occupied by Russia. Yeah, but what's interesting, the page is for the city of Kherson itself. So they try to spread that information. The people who are signed up for this Kherson page, they are kind of interested in all of the news, that in everything that is happening in the region too. And also we identified the pages that spread the activities to other regions, for example the administration of Kherson region, and we identified the most number of such pages for Kherson and Donetsk regions, about 40 for Kherson and 20 and something like 25 for the Donetsk region. If we look back into history, the most active Vkontakte pages were created in 2014, 2015 and in 2022, 2023. And what was interesting for us, that back in during both of those periods, 2014, 2015 and 22, 23, those pages were created for Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as for Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. For example, a page created back in 2017 was dormant for a long period, and in 2022, when Kherson region was occupied, the page resumed its activity and has become the administrative page of Department of Culture, which means that Russians were preparing to capture Zaporizhia and Kherson way back ago, back in 2014 and 15, but fortunately it has never happened. We've also checked the categories of the pages that were active in Vkontakte within all that period, and the most active were the pages of the local oil leagues, which shows the social and economic condition of those territories, and a little bit less active, or I would say we found less pages by the news agencies, or like just media, where they post some news about how great it is to live in those occupied territories, where you can come for humanitarian aid from a conditional St. Petersburg. And those news pages for us are the most dangerous, because they translate refined Russian propaganda. a lot of things are there about very bad Ukraine, very good Russia, how Russia helps, how they help to rebuild Mariupol. All that stuff you can find concentrated in those pages. We've also identified a number of the administrative pages. They are the replacement of local administrations, announcements of important persons coming from Russia, some top-level officials, and we also identified some specific categories such as search for real estate property, people looking for jobs, and in that category of people looking for jobs we were surprised by the fact that there were no vacancies in fact in those occupied territories. However, you can find a lot of vacancies by the businesses in Tula, Syktyvkar, or other places in Russia. So it's one of the methods to pull Ukrainians to Russian mainland, to bring them away from temporarily occupied territories to Russia, to other cities in Russia. And the same story is with the education. It's exclusively the invitations for the students from temporarily occupied territories to study in Russian higher educational institutions, and search for the people was most difficult category for us. We identified 7 such pages, and the biggest concentration was in Mariupol and Severodonetsk. Well, to summarize our research, we see that starting from 2014, Russia very actively uses social networks to isolate the information field in temporarily occupied territories, and they try to fill this space with their information influence. And that will be our big problem, not only now when we try to reach out to those people in the temporarily occupied territories, but also when those territories are getting back to Ukraine, because the fact that people live there, they are being imposed some things like the thoughts, what content should they consume, what thoughts they should express. So when the next election comes and they have to vote for some government, the people will need to understand, so to say. It will be more difficult for them to understand what content they can trust to, which content does not spread social tension among them. And it's important for us to prepare not only counteroffensive, the military counteroffensive, but also the information counteroffensive, the deoccupation policy, because what's going on in those territories is the serious violation of human rights in information field. Well, that's it for us. We would like to thank you for your attention, and also we invite everybody to read the full text of our research in our web media. Thank you. I would like to proceed to the questions right away, so we understand that now we don't have any opportunity, neither our government or civil organizations can make a representative research about what's going on in temporarily occupied territories, but at the same time we would like to understand whether everything is so bad with the information vacuum, or our people still use VPN services to be able to use Facebook, Instagram, and other sources. Well, in view of that reason, we try to avoid some some statements, because it's impossible in our circumstances. In the first part of our research, we mentioned that we assume that it's probable or it's possible because Russia restricts the access to internet in temporarily occupied territories, to access to Ukrainian government organizations' website or international governments, government institutions and international organizations. So it's extremely important what is in fact going on in the temporarily occupied territories. I would even try to hold back my ambition to state something, because it only becomes known when we liberate more and more territories, and the representative conclusions can be made only as we bring all of our lands back to us. And yes, we have to remember that VPN exists, people can use it, but first of all we have to remember, for example, about the elderly or the people who have lower technical skills, who are not quite familiar with such instruments on one hand, and on the other hand we have to remember about the risks for those people in terms of using Ukrainian information platforms. We have to remember how Russia continues to police those places, how they screen people in the blog posts should people want to leave the area, and any traces that people continue following Ukrainian official media, Ukrainian government, it can pose threat, pose risk to the life and health of those people. That's an important factor, because even if it's technically possible, just imagine what are the risks faced by the people who switch on the VPN. Well, it's clear about VPN and the Telegram channels that as you mentioned, are one of the most powerful instruments that is used in the temporarily occupied territories. We understand that no one can hinder any person except for reading occupational government channels to read our channels too, for example, of the local governments which are in the territory under control of Ukrainian central governments or leaders of the public thoughts. Don't you think that it allows our Ukrainians to remain on the Ukrainian agenda at the same time? Well, for us in this case, Telegram, just like for Ukrainians and in the territory under control of Ukrainian government, and both in temporarily occupied territories, you know, it's the blessing and the curse at the same time, because we can use it for communication on par with the Russians. And really, the Ukrainians in the temporarily occupied territories, they may have access to Ukrainian media, and that may be one of the few ways to find out what's really going on in Ukraine, what's the situation, to make sure they're not forgotten, that they're being taken care of by Ukraine, to make sure they are brought back under control of Ukraine, to ensure their safety and security. But again, don't forget about the risks. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If you have any questions, please join our conversation. Well, we don't have questions on the floor. I want to thank you for this fundamental research. I'm reminding you, joining us was Olha and Anasatasia Romaniuk. Thank you for this presentation, and now our team is working on our schedule for tomorrow, so stay tuned, follow our announcements, work together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.